This is the hardest hitting single target build in the game. Welcome to the Billion Damage Club. This build melts through bosses, clears high level pits, and puts out insane damage. The question is, how does it all work? How do you achieve billions? Well, let's break it all down. I'm going to go over my setup. I have some gameplay of a tier 110 pit run without the use of holy bolts. My gear is far from perfect. I haven't finished my masterworking to level 12 yet, so I'm missing a massive amount of power. Check out the run and then let's break down the build. All right, let's go over the skill tree. We're going to start with Flay. We're going to put 5 points into Flay. Whenever you use Flay, you deal damage to an enemy, and you inflict bleed damage. That bleed damage lasts on my build for 20.27 seconds. That's increased from what it normally would be at. It can go even longer. This plays an important part and is probably one of the most important parts of this build, is getting that duration up. We're going to cover how you're going to increase that later, but remember, that is incredibly important. We're going to go up all the way through Enhanced Flay, which is going to give us vulnerable damage when we attack the enemies, and then through Battle Flay. When Flay deals direct damage to an enemy, they take 10% increased bleeding damage from you for the next 12.17 seconds. This is going to be the generator for our big damage. This is not going to be the big damage itself. It'll do a lot, but not as much as what we're going to cover later on. We're going to skip the core skills, coming down to Imposing Presence. This is going to give us a really, really big boost to life, so as many points as we can get into Imposing Presence. It's going to help our survivability. We're going to take 3 points into Martial Vigor for some extra damage reduction from elites. We're going to be taking Rallying Cry all the way down through Strategic Rallying Cry. This will give us our Unstoppable and our sources of Fortify. We're going to go Challenging Shout, just through Enhanced Challenging Shout. Coming down to War Cry, we're going to be taking all the way through Power War Cry. This is going to help clearing trash. Flay does incredibly well on bosses. Trash is where we're going to need a little bit of extra help. So we're not going to be able to get any benefit from this when we're fighting most of the bosses in the pit. But when we're getting there, this is going to help quite a bit. We're going to take 3 points into Booming Voice. This will increase the uptime on our shouts. However, when we're doing trash fights, there's really no downtime. It's pretty crazy. If you go back and watch the gameplay, shouts are up 100% of the time. Raid Leader. This is not commonly used in a lot of the builds, but for me and the way that I have this set up, this is actually really, really great. We'll cover that later on when we get into some more of the gameplay strategy. You heal 3% of your maximum life per second while your shouts are up. And like I said before, our shouts are up all the time. Guttural Yell. Your shout skills cause enemies to deal 12% less damage for 5 seconds, so a little bit more DR. Even more DR from Aggressive Resistance here. 3 points into Pit Fighter for some extra damage and some distant damage reduction. When you get into the final stages of the boss fights in the pits, when you're at high levels, the fights are long. So you want to do as much damage, especially in that last 35% of their life. That's when all 3 echoes are spawning. So this is going to give us a 23% multiplicative increase to damage when the bosses hit below 35% life. 1 point into Rupture, and we're going to be going all the way through Warrior's Rupture. Rupture is going to be our main source of damage. This is where the billions come from. All of the bleed damage that we're going to be doing is going to hit for, and I think in some cases can get up to billions of damage, but this is really where you're going to see your big numbers. When you rip your weapon out of an enemy, you deal damage to them based on the total amount of bleed, and you remove all of that bleed from the target. Ripping your weapon out of enemies during Rupture causes that explosion to deal bleeding damage for over 5 seconds. This damage is increased by 10% for every 50 strength that you have. It's a multiplicative number, and it's 380% right now based on my strength. Now remember, my masterworking is not maxed. I'm missing a lot of strength and a lot of power. So that number is going to keep on going up the more my masterworking gets caught up to where I'm supposed to be. This is where your billions come from. We're going to be taking Hamstring. We're also going to be taking Cut to the Bone. If I can find myself an amulet with ranks of Cut to the Bone on it, that multiplicative increased bleeding damage to vulnerable enemies, it's what's going to increase the amount of damage that we're doing with Rupture. So Rupture is going to take all of that bleed, explode it onto the enemy, and that does a ton of damage. So if we can do increased bleed effects, and if we get just 3 points, that's now 30% increased, it's going to be pretty crazy. That's where you see people doing this 25, 30, almost 40 billion damage hits with Rupture. It's right here. Going into Steel Grasp, we're going to be gaining vulnerable damage from Steel Grasp, which Flay gives us vulnerable damage, so it is an extra source, but it's not as important as in some of the other builds. And then we're also going to be going into Fighter Steel Grasp. This is going to generate Berserking for us for 2 seconds. This will definitely come in a lot more handy on bosses than it will when you're fighting trash, because when you're fighting trash, we're going to have War Cry up pretty much 100% of the time, so we will be getting our Berserking from them. This will help on bosses while your War Cry is cooling down. Going into Thick Skin, we took 3 points into Counteroffensive for some extra damage while you're fortified. 1 point just for a little bit of extra damage reduction while you're fortified. We're going to be taking 3 points into Heavy-Handed. While using Two-Handed Weapon, you deal 15% multiplicative increased damage. And then the last thing we're going to take is Gushing Wounds. What this does and why this is important. When causing an enemy to bleed, you have a chance equal to your critical strike chance to increase the bleed amount by 140% of your critical strike damage bonus. What does that mean? That's a mouthful. Let me show you. When you go and you look at your stat line here, I have a 74% chance to critical strike. That means 74% chance also to increase my bleed damage amount by 140% of my critical strike damage bonus. So we take this number times 140%, and that's the increase to bleed damage that we do. And I have a 74% chance to do that. So the more critical strike chance you add, the more that you're going to be able to increase that bleed damage by a massive amount. So Gushing Wounds is very, very important. Let's go over the Paragon board now. In the starter board, we're going to take all of the HP nodes that we can. We took the armor node here just because I'm barely over cap. Once I max out the piece of gear that has my armor stat affix on it, that will increase that stat enough that I don't need to have this on and I can take this off. In the starter board, we're going to be running Exploit. This is going to give us vulnerable damage, as well as when we hit an enemy, then we're also going to make them vulnerable. That vulnerable damage is actually going to play a huge role in this build, but we're going to talk about that later once we get into the Paragon board a little bit more. Moving up into the Warbringer node, we're going to be taking Executioner. While wielding a polearm, you deal 10% multiplicative damage. This also does extra damage that's additive to polearms, which is not quite as important as a multiplicative number, so that's why we're running Executioner there. In your Blood Rage node, the cap for your current bonus is 30%. In order to get there, you need to be about 300% damage while berserking. So you want to try and get as close to that number as you can so that you can put points into other things that will help increase your damage. In this board, we're going to be running Might. This is an 8% increased damage multiplicatively while wielding a two-handed weapon. Because we get 120% bonus to all magic nodes are the blue nodes here. That's why they're highlighted in green and not in white. We're getting an increase from this. That's where we get the extra damage reduction and the extra bleed damage. That's why we're seeing those green numbers increase there. Now this is really important here. I'm going to bounce around the Paragon board in the order that the boards need to go in. When you're building a Paragon board, the farther out you get from your starter board, the more that your rare nodes are going to cost. So if I put this right here on my final board, I would not be able to have enough willpower because that willpower is going to go up for every single board that you go out further and further. It's very important that you put these in the correct order. On the planner, that's going to be in the description, it's going to have little numbers in the top corner. Make sure you look at the numbers, follow the direction that the pathing goes. We're going to scroll down first. This is going to be your Decimator board. Making an enemy vulnerable increases the damage by 10% for 5 seconds. Now, Rupture overpowers. So we're going to be doing 20% increased multiplicative damage for 5 seconds because our enemies will be vulnerable and we're going to be overpowering with Rupture. So this is going to be another very big source of damage. In this board, we're going to be running Ire. This is where you're going to get some of that damage while berserking bonus. The next board that we're going to go into is going to be your Hemorrhage board. This is where it's really important. Remember that vulnerable damage that I was talking about in Exploit? The more vulnerable damage we have, and this is uncapped, this can keep on going up. This is like the Blood Rage node used to be. The more vulnerable damage that we stack, your bleed damage is increased by 15% of that vulnerable damage. Right now, my current bonus is 60% increase bleed damage. The more vulnerable damage you stack, the better. But you have to find a good balance between critical strike damage and vulnerable damage because remember, Gushing Wounds scales off of your critical strike damage. So we have two multipliers here that we're going to need to find a really good balance for finding vulnerable damage and critical strike damage. In this board, we're running Martial. Another 125% bonus to magic nodes. That's why we put this in here, because we're going to be getting damage reduction from bleeding, which is quite a bit. And we're also going to be getting physical damage over time, which physical damage over time is bleed damage. This also is going to give us our shouts, cool down our active skills. So we're going to actually notice this when we're doing boss fights more than when we're fighting trash. So Martial is a really big boost to that. Coming down into the Carnage board. While berserking, critical strikes increase your attack speed by 2% up to 16%. Can't really argue with more attack speed. The faster we attack, the more bleed we apply. In this board, we're going to be running Wrath. This is going to give us a boost to our critical strike damage, which we need for Gushing Wounds. We never spend any Fury, so we really don't need the skills that critically strike generate Fury, but that extra 100% increased critical strike damage is going to be important. Scrolling up, this board is going to be your Bonebreaker board. In this board, we're going to be running Territorial, 10% damage reduction from close enemies, and damage to close enemies. Damage to close is going to help because anything that is close, as we do damage to it, it increases the damage. That includes all of the damage that we're going to be doing with Flay, which is going to give us more bleed damage, which is going to increase all of those multiplicative numbers that we have for damage and make Rupture do more damage. There's a great glyph. It's going to apply some tankiness. That's the Paragon board. Let's check out the aspects, affixes, and tempers that we're going to want to be using. All right, let's jump in. Starting with the helmet, we're going to be running the Harlequin's Crest. If this is something that you don't have access to, you can use a regular helmet and you can put Might on it. Might gives us 20% damage reduction, just like the Harlequin's Crest does. It's actually going to provide you with a couple more affixes. The only difference is you're not going to get those +4 ranks to Flay. For the masterworking, I did want this to roll on cooldown reduction, so I'm going to have to re-roll this. But follow along the planner because I'm going to have what I want this to be versus what I actually have on the screen. There's going to be a lot in the planner that's going to be different than what I have because I haven't found the gear yet that I wanted. I haven't got the masterworking rolls, and I also haven't found the tempers that I really want yet. For the chest piece, we're running Rage of Haragoth. Lucky hit. Inflicting bleeding on an enemy has up to a 40% chance to reduce the cooldowns of your skills by 1 second. Every single time that we hit something and we inflict bleed, we have that extra lucky hit chance to reduce the cooldowns by 1 second. If you watch the gameplay loop and all my stuff is cooling, and as soon as Rupture goes off and inflicts bleed on everything, my cooldowns are all instantly. It is pretty crazy to watch. If you can get a greater affix on this, you want to try and get that damage reduction from bleeding because that's going to be probably the most important one. The other ones really don't do all too much. Coming down to the gloves, attack speed, critical strike chance, and vulnerable damage. 3 affixes that you want. Critical strike chance is going to probably be the most important. The closer that we can get to 100%, the more that we're going to have gushing wounds up. For your tempers, we're going to be running crowd control duration and critical strike damage. The critical strike damage comes from having the rogue temper. If this is something that you don't want to do, you can put any of the other damage on, damage while close. Straight damage was probably going to be the worst option to go for, but if you want to put something else on here, you can. But critical strike damage is going to be the biggest boost to gushing wounds. For the aspect, we're going to be running rapid. Basic skills gain 30% increased attack speed. For the pants, I had to put poison resist to get myself capped out here, so I'm running strength, poison resist, and then that ranks to Flay is really important. You want to try and find a greater affix for Flay, and then you're going to try and level that up as much as you can. For the tempers, we're running imposing presence. This is going to give us that increased life. If I can get some rolls on this, that's going to be better than having that 18 strength, but right now I'm in the process of re-rolling all of my gear, so I'm still working on that. Steel grasp stuns for 1.7 seconds. That can go up to 1.9. Every time that we use Steel Grasp, we're going to be stunning enemies as we pull them. This gives us a chance to use our skills and our shouts and get some bleed damage out there right before we use Rupture. For the aspect, we're running Might. This is going to give us an additional 20% damage reduction while we're using basic skills. Flay is a basic skill. If you attack the air, Might gets activated. Use an attack once at least every 7 seconds. You keep that 20% damage reduction. For the boots, we're going to be running movement speed. I needed armor and I needed max resistance. If you can move armor or the resistance all to your pants, you do have the option here to run ranks of Warcry. This is going to make sure that during the boss fights, Warcry is up a lot quicker. It's also going to give us a boost to damage. If that is an option for you and you can find it, that's going to be perfect. That's what I'm going to be looking for. But again, still working on the gear, so we're getting close. I don't have the temper that I wanted on this. I brick mine. The barrier generation should be crowd control duration. The movement speed is exactly what I wanted. I wish that I had a better roll, but that's okay. Coming down to our weapon, strength, max life, critical strike damage. You're going to alternate your weapons between critical strike damage and vulnerable damage to try and stack both of them, because this is a really great source of it. For the tempers, again, we're going with the rogue's critical strike damage bonus, and the most important temper for this whole build is the Flay duration. If you don't have that Flay duration, this build will not work. Flay has to be able to stack bleeds as long as possible so that it continues to build and build and build and build. And then that multiplier as it's building is what Rupture does to make sure that we're hitting those billions and billions of numbers. For the aspect, we're going to be running Moonrise. Damaging an enemy with a basic skill grants you 4% increased attack speed for 10 seconds. Once we attack 5 times with Flay, we're going to be gaining a Vampiric Blood Rage. That gives us 160% basic skill damage, which is Flay, and 15% movement speed. Okay, now you remember, I said my gear wasn't perfect. This sword is going to be getting upgraded. I'm going to just go over the tempers on this one because that's what we want, but I'm going to show you the sword that I actually want to be using and why I want to be using it. The sword is only 822, so I do need to upgrade this because it is affecting the tempers and the critical strike damage. So that's something that I do need to upgrade, and I have an upgrade for it here. Strength, max life, vulnerable damage. That's what I want to be running for this weapon here. The other weapon that I have on is critical strike. Remember, I said we're going to alternate between the weapons. Half of them are going to be vulnerable damage, half of them are going to be critical strike damage. With my tempers here, we're going to be running Flay duration and critical strike damage bonus, and the aspect is going to be Edge Masters. Your skills deal 20% increased multiplicative damage based on your primary resource, which ours is Fury. We're always going to have max Fury because Flay generates Fury and we're not spending any. For the other weapon, we're going to be running max life, strength, critical strike damage bonus, and this is where we're going to get our damage while berserking bonus. This is going to help max out our blood rage node, and of course, we're going to be running Flay duration. And I didn't get my double on here. I've been trying and trying and trying. It just will not land, so I'm going to have to re-roll this one eventually once the rest of my gear gets caught up. For the aspect, we're running intercom. In the run, you actually got to see that most of the time I was able to stand still for at least 3 seconds. So we're going to be taking advantage of the 30% some of the time, but either way, it's still a 10% multiplicative number when we're not standing still. For the slashing weapon, we're going to be running strength, max life, vulnerable damage. Now we're alternating back and forth between the two because this one is vulnerable damage, this one's critical strike damage. We're going to be running our damage while berserking temper here, and then our Flay duration here. I was able to get a double on it, so I got lucky here. Couldn't get a triple, but that's okay. You'll probably be luckier than I am. For the aspect, we're running Wanton Rupture. What this does is every 13 seconds, we're allowed to use Rupture without removing the bleed. Now picture this, you're fighting a boss. You're doing a ton of bleed damage. You use Rupture. Rupture does billions of damage now. It also explodes and does damage to the boss that causes bleed. It also increases your attack speed. So if it doesn't remove that bleed damage, all of a sudden you're attacking faster, you just did a massive amount of bleed damage to them, and you hit them really, really hard, your bleed stacks all of a sudden start to shoot through the roof. Then 13 seconds later, you will use Rupture again, and it doesn't remove that bleed, and you continue stacking. I'll show you in the gameplay loop later on what it looks like and how you get those billions, but this is a very, very, very important part of this, and also why this build is a little bit trickier to play. Coming up to the rings. Attack speed, critical strike chance. I would like to be running vulnerable damage here because my vulnerable damage bonus is only at 60%, but I have critical strike damage on here, which is not hurting me at all. We're going to be running Warcry, and if you have the tempers too, you can put critical strike damage on your ring. I was very scared to break this one because it's not a bad ring, so I didn't put the critical strike damage bonus on here from the rogue tempers, but it is an option for you, and I also have a perfect damage close roll, so I just left it alone. I'll find another one, and then we're going to be upgrading that as soon as we can. For the aspect, we're going to be running Bold Chieftain. Whenever you cast a shout, its cooldown is reduced by 2 seconds per nearby enemy, up to a maximum of 6 seconds. Right now, my cooldown is 20 seconds on my challenging shout. When I use that, if there's enough enemies around, the cooldown is now 14 seconds. It helps quite a bit, especially when you're doing boss fights and you need that to come up very quickly. The other ring, I'm running strength, attack speed, critical strike chance. Again, vulnerable damage would be better over strength here. I just haven't found that yet. I did get my critical strike damage bonus temper on here from the rogues, so the rogues did not let me down. And then I'm running Warcry cooldown reduction. We want to try and run that as much as we can. Ranks to Warcry cooldown reduction as best we can so that we have that damage bonus up all the time. For the aspects, we're running elements. Every 7 seconds, this is going to give us a boost to our physical damage. This is something that when you're going to be using Rupture, if you can time it just right to get the physical damage bonus on that Rupture, it's going to be increasing that amount of damage by that 30% multiplicative number. For the amulet, for the affixes, I'm a little torn on what I want to be doing. I know I need cut to the bone because that's going to be a huge increase to our bleeding damage. I don't know if I want to drop the cooldown reduction or if I want to drop the attack speed. We need the critical strike chance to help apply the bleed from gushing wounds. So here is where you can kind of mix it up a little bit. If your skills are not cooling down fast enough, then you can use cooldown reduction here over attack speed. If your skills are, then put attack speed on instead of the cooldown reduction. The attack speed really feels great when you're running this build, so I'm kind of on the fence about it. I'm going to look for another amulet, and I'm going to try it out, and I'll get back to you guys on what I felt was best. I needed to cap out my resistances, so I rolled one of my tempers here. If you feel okay, and you think that you're going to be able to live enough without having to max out shadow resistance here, you could run Imposing Presence and critical strike damage if you really wanted to. You'd lose out on the movement speed bonus, and you would not be capped on your shadow resistance. However, when I was running through the pits, I was actually running through at 115 with no lightning resistance at all, and I was still doing okay. You do feel it sometimes, but it is definitely a thing that might work if you can get your life up high enough and get your DR up there. Mess around with a little bit, but in the planner, I'm going to put at least one resistance here and then probably either imposing presence or critical strike damage. Feel it out, see what works best for you. If you want to put a resistance here, put a resistance here. If you want to try it out without it, you can, but just know you're going to be squishy. For your gems, I'm running shadow resistance as a temper here, and I'm also running poison resistance here. That allows me to use lightning resistance, cold resistance, and fire resistance gems. We're also running sapphires in all of our weapons. This is going to give us our extra vulnerable damage. Right now I have rubies in my gear for the extra life. I'm only running 47,000 life, but so far that has been enough to carry me all the way through 115, and I haven't even tested any higher, and my gear is not maxed out yet. So right now it feels okay. I don't feel like I'm super squishy. That may change if I put imposing presence on here. My life is going to go up even more. There are a lot of nodes in the Paragon board for life that I didn't take to. So if you want to mess around with that, that is definitely an option for you if you want more life. For the expertise, I've heard a lot of people talking about running pole arms as your expertise. We're already gaining that 15% X increased damage while healthy. So if putting on pole arms here only gives us a 15% lucky hit chance. If we need that for the cooldown from Rage of Haragoth, you can do that. Still, running your axe expertise is going to give you that 10% multiplicative damage to vulnerable enemies. For now, I'm going to be running with the axe. I'm going to test out as I start to get further and further into pit which ones I feel better. We're going to hit some training dummies, mess around with it, see what it feels like. But for now, I'm going to have the axe on. You guys have the option to use either your pole arms or your two-handed axe. We're going to go hit the training grounds. I'm going to show you the gameplay loop, why we do what, when, and how it all works. Starting with the skills. Flay is going to be the main source of stacking damage to use Rupture, which Rupture is going to be what does most of your damage. Flay will stack very, very high depending on how you manage your Rupture cooldown and how you manage Wanton Rupture. How this works, and we're going to do this in steps. The very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to use Flay. When you use Flay, if you can see, we start adding bleed damage. When we attack, that bleed damage continues to go up. Every single hit, it stacks more and more and more. And as you can see, it starts to increase very, very quickly the more that we attack. That will go up on vulnerable enemies. So when we make them vulnerable and we add Berserking, now when we attack, you see really, really big jumps, right? We're already doing 20 million, 25 million, and I'm not even spamming Flay. What this is doing, remember, Flay has a long duration. Flay has a 20-second duration. So as we're doing Flay, we hit once. That just bleeds and bleeds and bleeds and bleeds and bleeds. So every time that we add one, within that 20 seconds, we're now multiplying that bleed damage. This is going to be stacking up so that when we do finally use Rupture, now all of that damage that is on there that's been stacking over that last 20 seconds is going to explode and do a massive amount of damage. You see it's still going. This is a long time for bleed. Steel Grasp is going to make enemies vulnerable, but so will Flay, and it's also going to add Berserking if we don't have Warcry up. I'm going to start attacking. When we're using Rupture, if you see this gold bar around Rupture, that means that Wanton Rupture is ready to be used. It will not remove bleed. So if we attack just a couple times, and we have the golden bar, and we use this, Rupture hits for 131 million, but we're still bleeding. This is a weird animation because when it cools down, that gold bar is still there, but then it goes away. So now because it's just red, Wanton Rupture is not available. Once it comes back to this, we can use it again, and the bleed does not get removed at all. That's going to be a very, very important part of managing your cooldowns while you're using Rupture. It is an extra step to pay attention to, so sometimes it gets a little bit hard when you're trying to dodge echoes, you're trying to dodge boss fights, you're trying to dodge monsters' explosions. Like, there's a lot going on, but that is a very, very important part to stacking your damage. I'm going to show you a little bit of what the gameplay looks like when we're just going through and we're running our shouts. I'm going to start with Rupture so that I get the increased attack speed. There's no bleed on there to remove, so we're going to use Rupture, and then we're going to just Flay, 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 and we're going to alternate between using Warcry and Steel Grasp to keep our Berserking up. What Berserking looks like and what to look for is that little purple icon right there. Every time we use it, it's up for 2 seconds with Steel Grasp, and when we use Warcry, it's up for 4 seconds. We're going to start with Rupture, and then we're just going to start attacking. So now we're going to use Warcry, and as you see, the bleed damage starts to stack really, really quickly. Wanton Rupture's up, so we're going to use Rupture again for 5 billion. Warcry's up. We're up to 200 million now for stacks. Warcry again. Those cooldowns are coming up really, really quick. Wanton Rupture should be up in just a second. And we're going to use Warcry and Wanton Rupture for 10 billion damage. So that's going to be the rotation that you're going to want to run. You can try and rotate around your elements. Right now we're going to be going into our sun, which is what you want to look for. It's hard to see sometimes because it gets covered up. So that little sun and the moon right here, this is going to be your elements buff. When elements is on the sun, we're going to be gaining extra damage. When it goes to the moon, we're not going to be. But that was a very, very short gameplay version, and we already broke 10 billion. So as you attack longer and longer, which some of these boss fights get very, very long, you're going to be doing more and more and more as long as you time Wanton Rupture correctly. If you're running and you use Rupture, so we're still bleeding, we're still bleeding, we're still bleeding. If we use Rupture now, the bleed damage goes back down and gets reset. And now we have to start over from the beginning. If it falls off it... If it falls off at any point during that fight, you have to start over from the beginning, and it's going to make that boss fight drag on a lot longer. It is okay if it happens. You just have to reset, recalibrate, figure out exactly where Wanton Rupture is, but that is your gameplay loop. That's how it goes. This build is not easy to get the hang of. The first time I did it, I hopped in, I got all of my master working to level 8. I didn't worry too much about where my 25% landed. I went straight to 8, and then I went right into the pits, and then I died. I didn't know the rotation. I didn't know how to use all my cooldowns. I didn't know how to use my buffs. I didn't know what the gameplay style looked like. And I didn't realize how important the Flay duration was and how important the DR is going to be to this build. Make sure that when you hop into it, masterworking is going to be incredibly important and expensive and time consuming. This is not like the bash builds, where bash, you hop into it, you put some DR on, and then you just start bashing things, and you run really quick, you run through things. Bosses will die incredibly fast with this build, but it does take a little bit to learn. Give yourself a learning curve. Don't expect to hop in and see all of these numbers that you see on the screen. The first time I went in, I hit for 4 billion, and I was excited about it. Then I started paying attention to the build and how it worked and what built up to it. Then I went up to 10 billion. And then 13, and then 14, and now I'm up to 15 billion, and I can go higher. I just have to get some master working right. I have to finish and getting it to 12. It is incredibly important. Let me know in the comments what you think of the build. I love hearing from people, and I like adjusting builds. As we're going, and as I'm live on YouTube and Twitch pretty much every night, we've been adjusting, we've been tempering, we've been tweaking and testing. People stop in, they give me advice, we talk about like why I'm using things and why they're using things, and then that's how my builds evolve. So hop in, join the live stream, throw out there what you guys have been doing and what you've been running, what you find works, and then I'll share what we're doing. Hopefully you like the builds. Good luck doing those billions.